In your conversation with Adam yesterday, you were talking about some studies. I don't remember exactly the details. Would you
Okay.
mind, like,
Sure. Suicide is a major public health issue. It's the leading cause of death in the U.S. among military service members, and it's the second leading cause of death of Americans in general who are young adults, second only to accidents. So, suicide is a major problem, and understanding the risks of suicide and developing new strategies for dealing with suicide is critically important because clearly what we're doing is not enough. Now, it's been known for a while that there's some link between lack of sleep and suicide. We've known for decades that depression and insomnia are like this. They're really closely tied together. Insomnia is to depression as cholesterol is to heart disease. It's something that's there. If it wasn't the cause, it becomes something that makes it worse. We know that, at least in terms of depression, not only do most people who have depression have sleep disturbance, we also know that sleep disturbance is one of the best predictors that someone is going to develop depression. And if you have a history of depression and you track every depressive symptom over time, it's actually insomnia that's the best predictor of when your depression is going to come back. So insomnia and depression are really closely linked, and we've known this for a while, but what's the connection with suicide? So there have been a number of studies now looking at the role of sleep problems with suicide, mostly insomnia, but sometimes other things like nightmares. And what's been found is that poor sleep, again, mostly insomnia, but it could also be other elements of poor sleep, the people who aren't sleeping well are about 3 times as likely to think about suicide. But it's not just thinking. They're also about 3 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to someone who doesn't have insomnia. And they're actually about 3 times as likely to actually complete suicide compared to people who don't have insomnia. And a lot of these times, these are adjusting for the contribution of depressed mood. So insomnia itself seems to be doing something. And one question is, to what degree is it the insomnia, which is tied with depression in a lot of ways, but to what degree is it also the act that you're awake during the night? Because there's a lot of things that might happen during the night if you're awake, whether you have insomnia or you're just a short sleeper or you're a shift worker or whatever, that might be contributory. One of them is during the middle of the night, you're more likely to be alone. If you're going to commit suicide in the middle of the night, you might not have someone there to stop you. And also, things happen in the brain in the middle of the night. I mean, when you wake up in the middle of the night at like 2, 3 in the morning, you have the experience that you tend to be overly emotional. You tend to worry. You tend to blow things out of proportion. You tend to have trouble seeing things in perspective. You're sort of not as emotionally mature as you are during the day. And so what if you had someone who's repeatedly exposed to that? That might lead them to be thinking differently. So one of the things that we looked at was we just asked the question, is it more likely that a suicide is going to happen in the middle of the night versus during the day? And there are a number of other studies that have looked at this question. And what we found was when you chart it across the day, you see on average fewer suicides at night and more suicides actually occurring during the day. But when you look at that curve, what you see is actually you're not plotting the function of suicides, you're plotting the function of the proportion of the population that's awake. Because to commit suicide, you have to be conscious. So you have to be awake. So we asked the question, well, we wouldn't expect the exact number of suicides at 1 a.m. to be the same as the exact number as 1 p.m. because the vast majority of the population is unconscious at 1 a.m., where the vast majority is awake at 1 p.m. And so what we wanted to do, we wanted to see, if we somehow adjusted each hour and weighted it by the proportion of the population that's probably awake at that time, what would we see? And we actually found that data. So we had a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Matthias Basner, who's done a lot of work with something called the American Time Use Survey, which is a nationally representative sample where they look across the day and what are Americans doing across the 24-hour day. And so we were able to see what proportion of the US population was asleep at any given hour at the exact same years that we were looking at national suicide data from the CDC. And so we were looking at vital statistics records and death reports. And what we found was that when you adjust each hour by the proportion of the population that could commit suicide because they're awake, you see actually a very striking relationship where during the day, actually it's flat. There is no increase in suicide risk during the day. The increase that you see when you look at the unadjusted numbers, that's just the proportion of the population awake. But what you see at night, a sharp spike out of nowhere, starting at around 11, 12 o'clock, this sharp spike going up, peaking at 2, 3 in the morning, and then sort of dropping, where between the hours of 12 and 6 a.m., all of the elevated risk of suicide seems to occur there. That something is happening at night. And we looked at this, not only did we look at it across hour, we looked at it by bin of the day, we looked at it in every age group, every race, ethnicity, both men and women, and people who are depressed, people who have not depressed, at least no record in their history. We looked at people who had alcohol in the system versus people who didn't have alcohol in the system. This seemed to be a universal phenomenon. We've looked at season of the year. We've looked at what method they used to commit suicide, because all these were in the reports. Nothing. That it was not. It didn't matter who it was or how they did it. It was that they did it was predictive by it being nighttime. So being awake during the night seems to be a risk factor for suicide. And it's interesting where if you look at least news reports even of high-profile suicides, you see, ever since we found this, I've been paying attention. And you see things like was discovered in the morning, you know? These are things that happen at night. And so what is it about at night? So we have some ideas, but it just really goes to show that there's a lot of untapped potential in recognizing the importance of sleep in preventing suicide.
And sleep health, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so people who aren't sleeping well, people who are up during the night, people who aren't maintaining good sleep health, whether they're shift workers, whether they have insomnia, whether they're just sleep deprived because they're overworked, the insomnia might play an important role in the depression elements of it, but it looks like the act of being awake itself during the night, whether you're depressed or not, might be really important.
Yeah.
And so sleep health, we talk about sleep health being important for things like your heart and for your weight and for your daytime function,
Sure.
and for not making mistakes or falling asleep at the wheel and all these other important things. Suicide might be added to that list. It might be time.
Yeah, I know. Personally, I'm a visual, creative person, so I work a lot better at night.
Right.
Which I love to do, except that I know that if I work during a whole night, in the morning, my heart is going to tell me, you're really pushed, why are you doing this to me?
Right, and I wonder if these things are connected, where we talk about in the middle of the night where some of the boundaries get removed. And so you might, on average, people who are sleeping better, I'll start the sentence again.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. On average, people who sleep better tend to be more creative during the day. We see that. But there's also this thing that happens at night where people report that if they're able to stay up, sometimes it can spur creativity, where it seems like some of their normal ways of thinking start falling to the wayside, and they might be able to perceive or think of things in new and open ways. That can be good or bad. That could be good in that you might be able to think of things more creatively in the middle of the night sometimes. But it might also be bad in that, if your ways of thinking are changed, just because they're changed doesn't necessarily mean that's always good. Sometimes
Sure.
removing barriers is a good thing, and sometimes it isn't. So I'm not saying it's always bad. It's just there might be a double-edged sword, where if you're prone to something like that, or even if you're not, maybe that you can become prone to it by being repeatedly exposed. So one of the things we're thinking is happening is that your frontal lobes, the parts of your brain that are really good at thinking and organizing and planning and that sort of thing, they might be reduced in activity even if you're awake during that time. Like they might be asleep, or they might be at least partially asleep even if you're awake. And what that means is some of the boundaries in your life that you create might not be as strong, and you might be able to perceive through some of those boundaries and maybe see something new. But at the same time, maybe those boundaries are also what are holding you together.
Mm-hmm.
And when those things are removed, sometimes other things can happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's amazing. Like there's the night's an amazing place. I mean, there's great potential, but with great potential comes another side. It comes some risk, and like in all things in life, with potential comes risk.
Sure.
And recognizing it is important. I'm not saying nobody should ever be awake in the middle of the night, but what I am saying is that if you are, know what you're doing and be prepared for it. And also, for example, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you start having these thoughts, one of the great things you can do is have a card you can pull out. Sometimes even physically patients do this, but even mentally say, look, if I'm freaking out about something that's the middle of the night, let me write it down and look at it again in the morning, where you have a technique where you can do this and recognize that, okay, well, maybe I'm not thinking about this super clearly. And you can address this because, interesting things happen in the middle of the night.
So I used to have like terrible anxieties. No longer. But once in a while, I still wake up in the middle of the night. And my method of dealing with anxiety was, I'm not going to let it like take over my life. So since I can't sleep, I'm just going to start working.
Actually, that's actually a really good solution. There's two things in there that are elements that I would tell my own patients to do. So number one, if you wake up in the night and are stressed out about something, then what you can say is, what can you do now that would be helpful? I mean, if you're worried about what you said to someone or what you're going to do tomorrow or anything, right now, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to be helpful. Worrying is not helpful. Maybe writing it down is helpful as a reminder, but there's nothing else you can do to be helpful. Staying awake and worrying is certainly not helpful. If you actually want to be helpful, maybe getting better sleep and being better rested for tomorrow, that might be able to help you. Like, you know what, if I actually go to sleep, I'll be actually better able to handle this thing, or if I write it down or whatever. But tell yourself that just worrying right now isn't what's helpful. What can I do that's helpful? Oh, nothing? Okay, well, at least I know that. There's nothing I can do right now.
Sure.
The other thing is the getting up. So if I had one piece of advice for anyone about sleep, it would be this. If you can't fall asleep, get out of bed. If you cannot fall asleep, get out of bed. If you're getting into bed in the middle of the night and you're laying there and you're tossing and turning and you're not able to fall asleep, 20, 30, maybe 40 minutes has gone by, get up.
The amount of negative energy that it creates is just unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, and same thing in the middle of the night. And the reason is because what you're doing is you're doing two things. First of all, by spending all that time awake in bed, you're diluting the bed's ability to be a signal for sleep. And the other thing you're doing is you're replacing the bed's ability to be a signal for sleep with having it be a signal for being awake. So like a lot of people say, I'm really tired, I get into bed, and then my mind just starts going. It's because you trained your mind to do that. Because this is the first chance your mind had to be with you and actually work through its issues for the day, now that you have no distractions. Well, you should have been doing that before you got into bed. Take some time before that. So it's like this. Imagine your favorite restaurant. You go to your favorite restaurant. Maybe you go there once a week to eat. And you walk in and you smell and you see and you start getting hungry. You start thinking, what I want. And even if you actually kind of just ate an hour ago, you get hungry because you've now tied that place with that feeling. But now imagine that you still go there to eat once a week, but now you go there another 3 times a week to sort of like watch the game on TV and sit at the bar. Now, all of a sudden, you go in there over time, you don't get as hungry as soon as you walk in because you don't eat a lot of the time that you're there. And so you're going in, and now if anything, you start walking in, you start thinking about what's on TV, where now the ability of that place to create that response for you is diluted and is now starting to get replaced with something else. And that's what happens with the bed. And there's data to show this. This has been known for decades in the sleep world. It's called stimulus control. And stimulus control alone is probably the most powerful thing you can do to protect your sleep, even if you don't have sleep problems, and to establish good sleep patterns moving forward. I mean, there are other things you can do too, and sometimes that's not enough. But in terms of bang for your buck, the easiest thing you can do now, that everyone should be doing this, is if you can't sleep, get out of bed. It sounds counterintuitive, right? To get more sleep, get out of bed, but it's not more sleep tonight. It's that you're preventing this problem later. Now, there's data that follows.
There is also the fact that if you don't fight against your inability to sleep, you remove one cause of anxiety.
Right.
So you can get up as a result of it, do something for 20 minutes.
Right.
The anxiety not being present, you may go back to sleep.
Yeah. So.
Or not. I mean,
Well, yeah.
like,
No, so a lot of people who have insomnia get very stressed out about their insomnia, and the insomnia starts feeding itself on the anxiety about itself. And this is a reason why this works, because you're replacing that with something else. Now, the only thing, I don't care what you do when you get up, just don't turn on any bright lights. Don't do something that's so mentally engaging that you don't recognize the passage of time. But other than that, do pretty much whatever you want. And that way you're not being stressed out about your insomnia. You're doing something else. You go back to sleep when you're ready, or set a timer if you don't know when you're going to be ready. Set a timer for half an hour or an hour, 45 minutes. Try again. If you don't fall asleep, get back out of bed. So yeah, there are a number of studies that have followed people as they go from good sleep and develop into insomnia. And looking to see what is it that makes the difference between someone who has an occasional trouble falling asleep and actual insomnia. And it turns out there have been a couple of studies that have been done on this. One in the UK by Jason Ellis and one in the US by Michael Perlis. And they both found the same thing, that there seems to be one really important ingredient that makes the difference between someone who doesn't develop chronic insomnia and someone who does. And that is, they don't do this. That when they can't sleep, they don't get out of bed. And the ones who do don't develop chronic insomnia. And the ones who don't, and they stay in bed and they fight and fight and fight, they lose the battle and they develop insomnia. So it's because sleep isn't something that you do. Sleep is something that happens to you when the situation allows for it. And when you're trying to take control of it, but you're doing it in the wrong way. Instead of controlling the situation, you're trying to control your sleep. And you can't control the sleep. You can only control the situation and let the situation allow for your sleep. And if it's not allowing for it, don't try and force it. You're just going to make it worse.
In fact, the only way you can fall asleep is not having control.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the bird in your hand. Like you grasp it, it flies away. You let it lay on your hand, and if it comes to you, it comes to you. If it doesn't come to you, grabbing for it isn't going to make it come to you faster.
On the opposite.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting.
All right.